They called it a peace deal. They called him a peacemaker. But then the missiles flew and the skies over Iran lit up with fire. What kind of peace ends in blood? What kind of diplomacy leaves ashes behind? This isn't just a story of betrayal. It's a moment the world tried to dress up in silence. But today, we're pulling back the curtain, because behind the headlines, behind the Nobel nomination, lies a truth too loud to ignore. This speech isn't about politics. It's about reality. It's about how one promise of peace was shattered in front of the entire world. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll see how one strike didn't just shake a nation, it exposed a system. And once you hear it, you won't forget it. When Donald Trump stood on platforms preaching peace, promising to end wars and bring American troops home, many believed he would be a different kind of president. He spoke about ending the endless wars that drained American lives and dollars, and people listened because the words sounded like hope. But beneath those speeches was a strategy layered with contradiction. His administration didn't scale down global tensions. It shifted them, dressed in the language of diplomacy while moving chess pieces behind closed doors. The facade of peace was powerful. It gave the impression of progress, of restraint, while aggressive sanctions crippled nations and covert operations laid groundwork for open conflict. Iran became a central figure in this game. While Trump told the world he wanted no war, he walked the edge of one with every drone in the sky and every threat in a press conference. Peace was the brand, but power was the product. Behind the optics, America's presence in the Middle East didn't disappear, it evolved. It became more calculated, more shadowed, more dangerous. Peace was used as a shield, a distraction, a way to justify moves that would have been condemned if made without the right words to cover them. The narrative said peace, but the policy screamed provocation. From pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal to ordering the killing of Qasem Soleimani, the administration sent a message not of withdrawal, but domination. And while the American public may have seen troops returning home, they didn't see the buildup of economic warfare, the silent blockades, the proxy movements, or the regional chaos that filled the vacuum. Trump's foreign policy, especially toward Iran, wasn't about peace. It was about control, influence, and leverage. The speeches sounded soft, but the actions were sharp. The contradiction wasn't an accident, it was the strategy. Speak softly, act harshly, and hope no one connects the dots until it's too late. Trump's peace promise became a tool, not a mission. And by the time bombs were falling, by the time tensions flared, the mask slipped. What was left wasn't the image of a peace bringer, but a president who sold the world a story while playing a game of power with no rules and no remorse. The bombing of Iran under Trump's administration wasn't just another military operation. It was a defining moment that exposed the sharp edge behind the soft words. It wasn't a tactical move done quietly in the background of diplomacy. It was loud, deliberate, and calculated to send a message far beyond Tehran. The decision to strike Iranian targets came not as a last resort, but as a show of dominance dressed as defense. It shifted the tone of U.S.-Iran relations from strained to openly hostile, tearing down any remaining illusion of dialogue or peace. While Trump claimed he wanted to avoid war, his orders told a different story, one that pushed the region closer to the edge of catastrophe. The airstrike that killed General Qasem Soleimani was a political bombshell as much as a military one. It shocked the global stage and triggered a wave of retaliatory threats from Iran. Within hours, the world braced for a war that hadn't been declared, but had already begun in spirit. The strike wasn't simply about neutralizing a threat. It was about proving a point. It was meant to remind Iran and the rest of the world that the United States still held the hammer and would swing it when it pleased. But in doing so, it violated the very image of restraint that Trump had built. He wasn't de-escalating, he was igniting. The consequences were immediate and far-reaching. Protests erupted across the Middle East. Iran launched missiles at U.S. bases in Iraq in response. Tensions skyrocketed in a region already drowning in instability. Global markets shook. World leaders issued warnings. Allies distanced themselves, and everyday people on both sides held their breath, knowing that once blood is spilled, diplomacy rarely has a voice loud enough to stop the bleeding. This wasn't a tactical chess move to outsmart an adversary. It was a theatrical act of aggression wrapped in the American flag, performed under the illusion of self-defense. And while Trump's base may have cheered the boldness, the world saw the cost. It wasn't just a general who was killed, it was the credibility of the peace promise. The moment the bombs fell, the narrative of diplomacy was buried beneath the rubble. What remained was the echo of a broken vow and the terrifying clarity that peace had never truly been the goal. It was just a line in a speech, never meant to be honored, when power could speak louder. When the world heard that Donald Trump was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, many blinked in disbelief. Just months before, he had ordered a military strike on Iranian soil, escalating tensions that brought the region to the brink of war. Yet here he was, being celebrated for peace. It wasn't just ironic. It was insulting to many around the world who had watched their nations burn under the weight of American foreign policy. The Nobel Peace Prize has long stood as a symbol of diplomacy, restraint, and moral courage. But now it was being used to paint a narrative that directly contradicted the reality on the ground. The man who approved drone strikes, who withdrew from key nuclear agreements, who inflamed tensions in the Middle East, was now being offered a seat at the table of peacemakers. This move revealed a staggering level of hypocrisy. It showed how easily powerful figures can rewrite the story, shaping public perception with grand gestures while ignoring the devastation left behind. The nomination wasn't about genuine peace, it was political branding. It was about rewriting the headlines, replacing images of explosions with photo ops and carefully crafted speeches. And for some in the global elite, it worked. They applauded agreements that ignored the deeper conflicts, that silenced the suffering of millions so that one man could appear as a peacemaker. But in the hearts of those who lost loved ones to bombings, who lived through the fear of retaliation, who watched their homelands turn into battlegrounds, the nomination was a cruel joke. It wasn't just that Trump didn't deserve the prize, it was that awarding him would cheapen its meaning. It would say that peace doesn't require justice, that diplomacy can come with missiles, and that global applause matters more than global consequences. The Nobel Peace Prize was never meant to be a marketing tool, but in this case it became one, a shield against criticism, a trophy held up to distract from the truth. And while Trump stood under the spotlight, the smoke from his decision still lingered over cities half a world away. The outrage that followed wasn't just about a nomination, it was about what it represented. A system where power can distort truth and where the image of peace can be bought even while the world still bleeds. The moment bombs were dropped on Iran, the global reaction was instant and fierce. From parliaments to protests, from press rooms to prayer halls, voices rose in anger, disbelief, and frustration. This wasn't just another military strike. It was seen as a reckless act by a world power that had promised restraint and delivered destruction. Allies who once stood beside the United States in diplomatic arenas began to hesitate, their silence louder than their words. Leaders from Europe expressed concern, urging calm while questioning whether they could still trust an administration that made such a volatile move without consulting its partners. The strike not only fractured trust, it widened the rift between America and the very countries it once counted on for support. International organizations like the United Nations found themselves scrambling to respond to a crisis they hadn't anticipated. They called for de-escalation, but the damage was already done. Iran vowed revenge, global markets quaked, oil prices surged. The balance of regional power, already delicate, was thrown into chaos, and while Trump's base in America might have viewed the strike as strength, the rest of the world saw instability and the dangerous unpredictability of a superpower acting on impulse. What struck hardest wasn't just the act itself, but the disregard for its consequences. It wasn't strategic warfare, it was shock and awe politics, the kind that cares more about headlines than human lives. And the world responded not with applause, but with alarm. In London, Berlin, and Ankara, diplomats began reevaluating their alliances. In Baghdad and Beirut, people took to the streets in outrage. The bombing became a symbol of betrayal, not just against Iran, but against the principles of global cooperation and lawful restraint. Even inside the United States, the decision drew sharp criticism. Lawmakers from both parties questioned the legality of the strike and the lack of congressional approval. Military experts warned of long-term repercussions. The move had made the world more dangerous, not less. It hadn't solved a problem, it had created a dozen more. And through it all, the international community watched with growing concern, realizing that the U.S. under Trump had become less a stabilizer and more a disruptor. The fallout wasn't just diplomatic, it was moral. The world expected leadership, and instead it got escalation. Trust once lost is hard to regain, and in that moment, America's global credibility cracked under the weight of its own contradictions. Across the Muslim world, the bombing of Iran under Trump's administration didn't come as a surprise, it came as confirmation. Confirmation that the promises of peace, the handshakes on television, and the carefully crafted speeches were never truly meant for the people of the Middle East. For years, many in the Muslim world watched as American leaders spoke of freedom and diplomacy, yet left behind drone strikes, shattered cities, and broken families. When Iran was struck, it felt like history repeating itself. Another chapter in a long book written in blood. Trump's rhetoric about ending wars rang hollow because the pattern didn't change. The names changed, the speeches got sharper, but the bullets kept flying. This moment awakened a deep awareness across the region. People in Damascus, Baghdad, Kabul, Tehran, and beyond looked around and saw through the illusion. They realized that peace was a performance, staged for votes and applause, while behind the scenes real lives were being destroyed. The bombing didn't just hit Iranian soil. It struck the already wounded trust of millions. It reminded the Muslim world that Western diplomacy often comes with conditions, and that silence or submission is the price of survival. For Iran to be targeted despite ongoing discussions of peace revealed a harsh truth. When power feels threatened, promises become expendable. Communities that once held out hope for diplomacy began to shift their thinking. They no longer waited for fairness from the same systems that had failed them time and again. They began seeking unity elsewhere, among themselves. The divide and conquer tactics that once worked so well began to weaken as more people saw their shared struggle not as isolated incidents, but as a global pattern of suppression. The strike on Iran became a unifying moment of realization. It reminded Muslims everywhere that until they stood together, their voices would remain unheard and their nations vulnerable to the next agenda disguised as peacekeeping. This shift was subtle but powerful. It changed conversations in homes, in mosques, on campuses. It fueled a new kind of resistance, not built on hatred, but on clarity. The clarity that real peace doesn't come from the hands that drop bombs with one hand and offer awards with the other. It comes from truth, justice, and unity that can't be bought or manipulated. The bombing wasn't just an act of war. It was a breaking point, one that forced the Muslim world to see the masks come off and understand finally and fully what was always hiding behind them. The strike on Iran didn't just expose a moment of military aggression, it revealed a deeper sickness in the way global power operates. It was the peeling back of the curtain, showing how modern politics had become more about illusion than integrity, more about image than accountability. Trump's administration claimed to pursue peace, but the actions taken told a story of strategic chaos and moral contradiction. The bombing wasn't isolated, it was the culmination of a pattern where public declarations of diplomacy served as distractions while policies of destruction played out behind closed doors. This wasn't about defense, it was about dominance. And that message echoed far beyond Tehran. What made this moment so striking was how boldly it challenged the idea that powerful nations are bound by the same standards they impose on others. International law, sovereignty, restraint. These ideals are demanded of smaller nations, yet routinely dismissed by the very powers that preach them. The bombing under a peace-preaching administration was proof that those in power are often more committed to controlling narratives than to upholding justice. It showed that peace can be politicized, turned into a slogan, stripped of its meaning, and worn like a costume during election season. This realization didn't just wake up critics, it woke up a generation. People around the world, especially the youth, began questioning not just the decisions being made, but the entire system that allows them. They saw how the mechanisms of war were hidden behind press briefings and PR campaigns. They understood that when a leader can kill with drones and still be considered for a Nobel Peace Prize, something is fundamentally broken. It wasn't about one man. It was about how the structure of global leadership had become unanchored from truth. This was a revelation not just about a failed promise, but about the future. It forced millions to confront the reality that if peace is defined by the powerful, it will always serve the powerful. True peace cannot exist where there is no accountability, no transparency, and no justice. The strike was a mirror, and in that reflection, the world saw the deep fracture between what is said and what is done. It wasn't just Iran that was targeted, it was trust. And once that trust was broken, the world could no longer pretend it didn't see the game for what it truly was. What unfolded wasn't just an airstrike, it was the unmasking of an era. An era where power dressed itself in peace, where destruction was cloaked in diplomacy, and where the world was told to applaud while bombs fell in silence. The promise of ending wars turned into a strategy of controlled chaos. And the Nobel Peace Prize nomination became the final symbol of how far truth can be twisted when the image matters more than the impact. But through that smoke and hypocrisy, something powerful was revealed. Clarity. The kind of clarity that awakens not just one nation, but an entire generation across borders, faiths, and languages. Because when peace becomes performance, the people become the audience who can choose to stop the show. This wasn't just Iran's moment, it was the world's reckoning. And now, with eyes wide open, history watches closely, waiting to see who will rise, who will speak, and who will finally tell the truth without fear. Thank you for listening, not just with your ears, but with your heart. In a world full of noise, truth is a rare echo. To those seeking justice, keep walking. To those speaking truth, keep rising. And to every soul who refuses to stay silent in the face of power, good luck. Your courage is the beginning of real change. Thank you. Stay strong, stay aware, and never stop questioning what they want you to forget.